was a cold November evening when Sean, a freelance photographer, packed up his equipment after a long day of shooting landscapes in the countryside. As dusk fell, he realized the only route back to his hotel cut through a remote stretch of road known as Blackwood Drive. Locals whispered about the road's eerie history, a series of mysterious disappearances over the years, but Sean dismissed such stories as local folklore. His GPS showed it was the fastest way home, shaving off 45 minutes from the drive, so he didn't hesitate. The road was a single-lane stretch, flanked by dense forests on both sides. As his car headlights pierced through the thick darkness, a fog began to settle, swallowing the road in a ghostly haze. About 15 minutes into the drive, Sean noticed a figure standing on the side of the road. It was a young woman wearing a white hoodie, waving frantically for a ride. Despite his better judgment, he slowed down. Something about the desperation in her eyes compelled him to stop. Rolling down his window slightly, he asked, "Are you okay?" I need to get to Blackwood Junction," she stammered, her breath visible in the cold air. "Please, it's urgent." Sean debated for a moment. The junction wasn't far, and she looked harmless enough. Against his instincts, he unlocked the door. "Get in." The woman climbed into the passenger seat and buckled her seatbelt without saying a word. Her pale face was turned toward the window, and she barely glanced at him. Sean noticed her trembling hands and asked, "What's going on? Are you running from someone?" She shook her head. "Just, please don't stop until we get there." They drove in silence for a few miles. Sean kept glancing at her out of the corner of his eye, noticing how she clutched her hoodie tightly around her. As the fog thickened, his GPS signal began to flicker. The screen displayed a spinning icon, unable to load the map. "Great," he muttered under his breath. Suddenly, the woman turned to him. "Don't stop, no matter what happens." Her voice was firm, almost commanding. Before Sean could ask why, a loud thud came from the back of the car, as if something had landed on the trunk. He instinctively hit the brakes, but the woman grabbed his arm. "Keep driving," she screamed. Sean's heart raced. What the hell was that? "Don't look. Don't stop," she repeated, her voice trembling now. Against every instinct, Sean pressed the accelerator, the car speeding down the foggy road. He could feel his palms sweating as the thuds continued, rhythmic and deliberate, as though someone, or something, was crawling on the car. Sean couldn't help but glance at his rearview mirror. At first he saw nothing but darkness. Then a shadowy figure came into view. It was crouched on the trunk, its pale face pressed against the rear windshield, staring directly at him. Its eyes were empty, black voids, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. Sean's blood turned to ice. "What the—" The woman screamed, "I told you not to look." Before he could respond, the figure disappeared as if it had melted into the fog. The thuds stopped, leaving only the sound of the car's engine and Sean's labored breathing. "What the hell was that thing?" he demanded, his voice shaky. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she whispered, "It's too late. You saw it." As they approached what Sean assumed was Blackwood Junction, he noticed something strange. The road signs were faded and rusted, the letters barely legible. The junction itself seemed wrong. It wasn't the lively crossroads he'd expected, but a ghostly, deserted intersection with a single flickering streetlight. "Is this it?" Sean asked, slowing the car. The woman nodded, but didn't move to get out. Instead, she turned to him, her face pale and eyes hollow. "Thank you for the ride," she said softly, "but this is where you need to make a choice." Sean frowned. "What are you talking about?" Before she could answer, the car's engine sputtered and died. The headlights flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. Sean tried the ignition, but it wouldn't start. Then he heard it, a low guttural growl coming from the trees. Shadows began to shift and move, circling the car. "Get out," the woman said urgently. "Run." Sean stared at her. "What about you?" She smiled faintly, but it wasn't reassuring. "I'm not leaving." Sean hesitated, but the growling grew louder, closer. Without another word, he grabbed his flashlight from the glove compartment and bolted out of the car. The fog was suffocating, and the cold bit at his skin as he stumbled down the road. He could hear footsteps, no hoofbeats, behind him, echoing ominously. When he finally dared to look back, he saw it, a monstrous, horse-like creature with glowing red eyes and jagged teeth. Its body was twisted and malformed, its hooves sparking against the asphalt as it charged toward him. Sean ran faster than he ever thought possible, the creature's growls filling his ears. Just as it closed the distance, the flashlight flickered and went out. He tripped, falling hard onto the pavement. When Sean woke up, it was dawn. The road was empty, his car nowhere in sight. His phone, flashlight, and even his camera were gone. Disoriented, he walked until he reached a small gas station. The attendant looked up as Sean stumbled inside. "You okay, buddy? You look like you've seen a ghost," the man said. Sean nodded weakly. I was on Blackwood Drive." The attendant's face darkened. "Blackwood Drive. That road's been closed for years. Landslide wiped it out in '98. Where'd you say you were?" Sean froze. He turned to look at the road behind him. It was gone, replaced by a dense wall of trees. And as he walked back outside, he noticed something chilling. On his wrist was a faint bruise, shaped like a woman's handprint. Months later, Sean stumbled across a news article about Blackwood Drive. The picture accompanying the story made his blood run cold. It was the woman he'd picked up, smiling faintly in an old photo. The article described her as one of the many people who had gone missing on the road over the years. Sean never drove at night again. Jason had been driving all day, eager to get home for the holidays. His usual route was blocked due to heavy snowfall, so his GPS suggested an alternative, a shortcut through a remote jungle road known as Raven's Hollow Woods. The name sounded vaguely familiar. He'd read something about the area in passing, but couldn't remember what. He brushed it off as unimportant. It was nearing midnight, and the dense fog that blanketed the road reduced visibility to almost nothing. The jungle trees grew closer together the deeper he drove, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The road was narrow, winding, and riddled with potholes. He turned down the music to focus, his headlights the only source of light in the suffocating darkness. As he rounded a curve, his GPS stuttered, the screen glitching before displaying no signal. Jason groaned, tapping the screen. He was completely reliant on the device and hadn't memorized the route. The road stretched on in eerie silence. Suddenly something darted across the road ahead, a shadowy figure, fast and fluid, moving on all fours. Jason slammed on the brakes, his car skidding to a halt. He scanned the area with wide eyes, his heart racing. "What was that?" he muttered, gripping the steering wheel tightly. He waited for a moment, his headlights illuminating nothing but the trees. Just as he was about to continue, His eyes caught something unusual. A wooden sign stood crookedly on the side of the road, its paint chipped and faded. He squinted to read the text. "Do not stop. Do not leave the road." Jason chuckled nervously. Great. Creepy roadside warnings. Perfect. He took a deep breath and pressed the gas, the tires crunching gravel as the car crept forward. But his nerves were frayed, and he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Minutes later, Jason noticed a faint glow in the distance. As he drove closer, his headlights revealed the source, a small wooden cabin, partially obscured by vines and moss. The structure looked ancient, its roof sagging, and its windows broken. But oddly, a dim light flickered inside. Jason slowed down, debating whether to stop. His fuel gauge was dangerously low, and his phone had no signal. Against his better judgment, he pulled over. "I'll just see if someone's there," he muttered. "Maybe they have a phone or gas." He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the car. The jungle was unnervingly quiet, save for the crunch of gravel beneath his boots. He approached the cabin, every instinct in his body screaming at him to turn back. The wooden steps creaked as he climbed them, and the door swung open with a soft groan. The interior was dimly lit by a single oil lantern sitting on a table. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs hung in thick sheets from the ceiling. The air smelled of damp wood and decay. Jason hesitated on the threshold, unsure whether to enter. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing in the small space. There was no response. Jason stepped inside cautiously. The floorboards creaked under his weight, and the dim light cast long, undeclaring shadows on the walls. His flashlight beam landed on something odd, a large wooden board hanging on the far wall. Symbols were carved into its surface, some resembling ancient runes, others crude stick figures. Beneath the symbols, in uneven handwriting, were the words, "It watches from the trees." Jason's stomach churned. What did that mean? He turned to leave, but froze when he heard a noise, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere inside the cabin. "Is someone there?" he called, his voice trembling. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to be coming from beneath the floor. Jason aimed his flashlight down and noticed a trapdoor partially hidden under a threadbare rug. Against every instinct, Jason crouched and pulled the rug aside. The trapdoor was old and wooden, with a rusted iron handle. He hesitated, his heart pounding. Then, summoning his courage, he tugged it open. The tapping stopped. Jason aimed his flashlight into the opening. A ladder descended into darkness, the faint smell of rot wafting up. He shivered and quickly slammed the trapdoor shut. "I'm not doing this," he muttered, backing toward the door. But as he turned to leave, the cabin's front door slammed shut on its own. Jason spun around, his flashlight flickering. The air grew heavier, and a deep guttural growl echoed through the room. Jason's breath caught in his throat as a shadow passed across the broken window. Something, or someone, was outside. He ran to the door, pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Then he heard it, a low, dragging sound, like claws scraping against the cabin walls. It circled the structure slowly, deliberately. Jason backed away, his flashlight shaking in his hand. Suddenly, the growling stopped. The silence was deafening. Jason dared to peek out the window, and his blood ran cold. A figure stood at the edge of the tree line, barely visible in the faint glow of the cabin's lantern. It was tall, impossibly thin, and its head tilted unnaturally to one side. The figure stepped forward, its movement jerky and wrong, like a puppet on strings. Jason didn't wait to see more. He grabbed the lantern from the table and smashed it against the door, breaking it open. He bolted to his car, fumbling with the keys as the figure emerged from the shadows. He started the engine just as the figure reached the car. It slammed its hands, long claw-like fingers, against the driver's side window. Jason screamed and floored the gas pedal. The car sped down the jungle road, the figure disappearing into the darkness behind him. But the nightmare wasn't over. As Jason drove, the jungle seemed to close in on him, the trees growing denser and the road narrower. His headlights caught glimpses of movement, shadows darting between the trees, eyes reflecting the light. A deafening roar echoed through the jungle, and Jason realized he wasn't alone. Something massive was chasing him, its heavy footsteps shaking the ground. Jason drove for what felt like hours, the jungle never seeming to end. When he finally broke through the tree line and reached a gas station, he pulled over, shaking uncontrollably. The attendant rushed out. "You okay, man?" Jason nodded weakly. "That jungle. There's something out there. A cabin. A creature." The attendant's face darkened. "You went through Raven's Hollow? You're lucky you made it out." "Most don't." Jason frowned. "What do you mean?" The man pointed at his car. Jason stepped out and turned to look. His stomach dropped. Deep claw marks scored the roof and sides of the vehicle, as though something had tried to rip it open. "You should burn that car," the attendant said grimly, "and pray it doesn't follow you." It was a late evening in late autumn, and Arvind, a weary traveler, was on his way back to his hometown after a long day of meetings in the city. His car's headlights sliced through the darkness, and the endless highway seemed to stretch on forever. He had taken the scenic route, hoping to enjoy the tranquility of the open road. But as the night wore on, the journey began to feel far longer than anticipated. The GPS on his phone had stopped working an hour ago, and the landscape around him seemed unchanging, a stretch of barren fields and hills. The night air outside was crisp, and the only sound was the hum of his engine. It was the kind of solitude that either calmed the soul, or, as Arvind was starting to feel, made the mind wander to darker places. Then out of nowhere, a sign appeared by the roadside, illuminated by the dim glow of his headlights. It read, "Hot tea, 1 kilometer." Arvind raised an eyebrow. Tea at this hour on a remote highway. He thought about how tired he was, and how a warm cup might be just what he needed to re-energize before continuing his drive. The sign promised only a small detour, and with no other cars in sight, he decided to stop. He took the turn off the main road, the tires crunching on gravel. The car's headlights illuminated a small clearing in the woods, and at the far end of the clearing, there it was, a small rustic tea stall. The wooden stall was perched by the side of the road, its roof sagging slightly under the weight of time. A faded banner hung above it, reading, "Best tea in the region." The stall was lit by a couple of yellowed bulbs that cast an eerie glow over the area. As Arvind pulled up, he noticed the stall seemed oddly isolated. There was no other sign of life around, no cars or pedestrians. It was almost as if this little tea stall existed in a world of its own, far removed from the highway that seemed to stretch forever behind him. The warm light spilling from the stall was inviting, so Arvind got out of his car, stretching his stiff legs as he approached the stall. The air was colder now, and the faint rustling of trees filled the silence. As he reached the counter, he saw the man behind the stall. The man was older, maybe in his 60s, with deep lines etched into his face. His eyes were sunken, almost hollow, and his skin was unusually pale, giving him a ghostly appearance. He stood behind the counter, stirring a large, steaming pot of tea. His movements were slow, deliberate, and unnervingly quiet. The man didn't say anything at first, just glanced at Arvind with an odd, knowing expression. "Good evening," Arvind greeted, trying to shake off the uncomfortable feeling that was creeping up on him. "I could really use a cup of tea." The old man nodded without speaking, his eyes never leaving Arvind as he prepared the drink. The sound of the spoon stirring in the pot was the only noise for a long moment. Arvind glanced around the stall, noticing how old everything seemed. The wooden tables were weathered and chipped, the chairs rickety. There was a faint, strange smell in the air, something like wet earth mixed with a metallic tang. After what felt like an eternity, the man poured the tea into a cup and handed it to Arvind. "It's hot," the man said, his voice hoarse but steady. "Drink quickly, or it will cool." Arvind smiled awkwardly, but the man's stare sent a shiver down his spine. He took the cup and nodded his thanks. The tea was delicious, too delicious. It was stronger than anything he had ever tasted, rich and fragrant, with an almost intoxicating warmth that spread through his body immediately. As he took a second sip, he felt a wave of relaxation wash over him. But something about the tea felt off. His thoughts began to feel hazy, and the world around him seemed to blur. His grip on the cup tightened. "Are you headed back home?" The old man's voice was barely audible over the sound of the wind. Arvind nodded. "Yes, just passing through. Long drive. I was hoping to find a place to rest." The man's expression softened, and for a brief moment Arvind thought he saw something unsettling in his eyes, an emotion that he couldn't place, something ancient and knowing. "There's a road not far from here," the man said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "A road that people don't often talk about. People who take that road, they don't always come back." Arvind chuckled nervously, assuming the man was just a quirky local with strange stories to tell. "I've heard my share of weird stories on the road," he said. "Nothing too spooky for me." The old man didn't laugh. Instead, his eyes grew darker and he leaned forward. "You may think it's just a story, but it's not. You'll see soon enough." Arvind's heart skipped a beat, and he began to feel uncomfortable. He tried to push the feeling aside. He had come for tea, not for a scary tale. As Arvind finished the last of the tea, something strange happened. The world outside the stalls seemed to change. The trees around him began to move in unnatural patterns, the shadows shifting like they were alive. The air grew heavier, and the wind howled louder. The warmth from the tea had turned into a strange, suffocating heat, making him sweat. Arvind stumbled backward, feeling lightheaded. He turned to the old man, but the man was no longer standing behind the counter. The stall had become completely silent, as if time itself had stopped. His thoughts began to swirl. He needed to leave. The old man's words echoed in his mind, but he didn't know why. He had to get in the car and drive away. He could feel the pull of the highway, but when he turned to leave the stall, the road had vanished. Instead, he was surrounded by dense trees, and the only way out was the narrow path that seemed to lead deeper into the woods. Panic surged in Arvind's chest as he tried to retrace his steps. He was disoriented, unsure of where he was. The road was gone, and he couldn't see his car anywhere. The stall had faded into the trees, and now he was standing in the middle of a forest with no way back. The wind began to pick up, and Arvind's skin crawled. There was no moonlight, no stars, only the oppressive blackness of the trees closing in. His phone still had no signal. He stumbled backward, tripping over roots and fallen branches. Then, through the trees, he saw something. The tea stall was back, except this time it looked even older, decayed and falling apart. The light that had once been warm and inviting was now a sickly, flickering green. And standing outside the stall was the old man, his eyes glowing eerily in the dark. "You should never have stopped," the old man's voice boomed through the trees. "No one ever does." Arvin's heart pounded as he turned and ran. He had to escape. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to get away from that figure, that place. But no matter how far he ran, the trees and the darkness seemed to close in on him, trapping him. He collapsed, breathless and exhausted, unable to move. The ground beneath him began to shake. The stall was moving toward him, growing closer and closer. Then, in an instant, everything stopped. The world was silent again. The tea stall was gone. The trees were still. And the road reappeared in front of him, the highway that had seemed lost to him. His car was parked just ahead, the lights flickering like a welcoming beacon. Arvind didn't hesitate. He ran to the car, jumped in, and slammed the door shut. Without a moment's thought, he started the engine and sped away, not daring to look back. When Arvind finally made it to his destination hours later, exhausted and shaken, he checked his phone. The GPS had logged a strange, erratic detour that made no sense. But that wasn't what disturbed him. The real horror came when he checked the time. According to his watch, hours had passed during that short stop. But when he looked at the tea stall's location on his map, something truly unsettling caught his eye. The stall wasn't marked on any map. There was no record of it anywhere.